So along with the topics of the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, it's important for us to also understand other pieces that are going on within Europe in the early 19th century. The 19th century in general is a period of massive growths in nationalism globally, in particular in places like Europe and North America. But you also see nationalism as a budding institution or a budding ideology globally. Now, this is not a global history course or a world history course, but when we talk in a few weeks about incidences that go on in places like China and Japan, it's important for us to understand that nationalism was not just a European or a North or South American thing. It was a global thing. So nationalism is this love or pride for one's country. And it really, in a lot of ways, stems from the French Revolution. Now, how is that? If you remember back to our discussion of the French Revolution, one of the things that I tried to point out was that the French Revolution began to see France as a quote-unquote nation. Now, a nation is a group of people who have a common history, culture, language, tradition, religion in some cases, and they make that nationalism, that love of that group of people who tick those boxes, leads to a passion for those groups of people and a desire to strengthen that identity. Now, it's tough because in the United States, when we talk about nationality, we typically don't think of American or people from the United States. We sort of reserve that, let's say, for citizenship. But in Europe and in other parts of the world, nationalism really means much more about where you are from geographically, not sort of what we might think of as heritage here in the United States today. So how do we get that? In France, they start thinking about themselves as a nation, the National Assembly, right? We are an assembly representing this group of people, as opposed to the king, who the people sort of support or have God, God has chosen this person to rule us. So, when the French Revolution begins to move and Napoleon's troops start to conquer Europe, if you look at this map, right, by 1812, the French have massive control over Europe. Spain, obviously France, parts of the Italian peninsula, like we discussed, the German Confederation, which is a creation of Napoleon himself, the Austrian Empire, and the Cross, right? Now, when Napoleon is ultimately defeated in 1815, and the tide starts to swing back and Napoleon is moved out, we have the Congress of Vienna, we have the meeting that will ultimately try and reconstruct Europe, we start to see the spread of those ideas. In particular, in Germany, really almost immediately by the 1820s, there is a huge push towards unification, at least loosely, right? So Germany was not the Germany that we know of it today, right? And we'll talk more about this next week. Germany was not the Germany that we know of it today. Germany was a group of about 30 or so different German-speaking principalities, places that spoke German, have a common language, culture, tradition, heritage, but they are not one unified nation, one unified state, right? They don't have a capital that represents all of them. So when Napoleon is finally kicked out, the Confederation of the Rhine largely stays the way it was. It doesn't. They change the name to the German Confederation, but it's now it's a new entity. They incorporate some of the northern parts that had been taken, particularly Schleswig and Holstein, which creates a war later between Norway, Denmark, and Germany. What becomes Germany. Parts of Prussia, which have been absorbed by parts of Poland. All of that starts to get absorbed into this, right? And we have the Congress of Vienna, which we know, which we'll talk about in just a second. So when Europe is sort of resettled after the defeat of Napoleon, these ideas though have sort of speckled throughout, right? Nationalism. Well, okay, so let's think about this. We are German. We are not French. We do not want to be controlled by the French anymore or ever again. So we start to identify ourselves as, well, what makes us German? We speak German. We have this common system of measurements. We have this common system of history. We have this, in many ways, similar religion. So after the 18 teens and into the 1820s, Germany starts to have a more unified nation. They create something called the Zollverein, which is a trade partnership. So Germany changes. Europe itself changes, right? So this is a map from the 18 teens, the late 18 teens, right? So you have France as a smaller entity. The Netherlands comes back. German Confederation, as I mentioned. All of these entities that did not necessarily exist before pop back onto the scene. Now, these ideas have also spread. So the Congress of Vienna, as we said yesterday, was a meeting largely between the British, the French, the Austrians, Italy, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, and Spain. And the goal was to try and reset the clock, right? Now, the goal of this is, and what ultimately becomes the Treaty of Paris that results from it, is trying to restore the legitimacy of leadership, right? So in France, you have the bringing back of the Bourbon monarchy, particularly Louis XVIII, who is Louis XVI, the guy who was beheaded in the French Revolution, his grandson. And there's other revolutions which are covered in another video. But what happens is you have an attempt to reinstall aristocracy, monarchy throughout Europe, but people who have now experienced the liberal revolutions of the French Revolution and the impact of Napoleon are sitting there thinking to themselves, well, wait a second. We were told by the French who came through that we can be represented as a nation. We don't have to be represented by a king. We've been told that the church should have less power, but now you're telling me we need to bring back a represented church. You're now telling me that we can't have these liberal revolutions. We can't have these rights. Well, what's going on here, right? 10 years ago we were talking about this. Now it's 1825, 1820, whatever it is. We now can't have that. Where's the disconnect here? So throughout the 1820s and then particularly by 1830, you have small revolutions, and by 1830, a bigger revolution occurring in in France, right? So in 1830, as I say here, Louis XVIII is ultimately removed. Charles X comes in. A rebellion breaks out. Charles flees. There's a lot of different concerns here. And then finally, in 1830, they bring back Louis Philippe, or they bring in Louis Philippe. Now, Louis Philippe is from a minor branch of the Bourbon family. His last name is not Bourbon. He is what's called the Orleanist monarchy because he's from the city of Orleans. And in this reign, Louis does try to be more of a representative of the people. He calls himself the citizen king, but he also calls himself the king of the French people. And again, sort of how we think about the names there are significant, right? He sees himself as the king of the people, not sort of the king of just the geography. And it's an interesting way to think about it. But anyway, 1840, these liberal ideas are emerging throughout, right? And the same would be true for places like Germany, where we have another revolution that happens at this period. So in 1848, you have a revolution where the German Confederation now people in Germany start to rebel against the king and the leadership of Germany. And the king at the time, Frederick William IV, although he promises constitutional reforms, when there is a meeting called the Frankfurt Assembly, or sometimes the Frankfurt Convention, there is no agreement here from Frederick William IV on how to unify Germany. Now, a constitution is ultimately drawn up, and it doesn't necessarily unify Germany, but it's a constitution that provides rights to the German people. And again, thinking about the German people, not the German state, right? Again, the nation part of that. Now, the Constitution is approved by the people of Germany, and it goes to Frederick William, and then his successor, Wilhelm I, after Frederick William dies. And William I says, I am not going to take the Constitution from the streets, right, from the gutter. It's this way of sort of thinking of, Frederick William and then William I don't necessarily want to give the rights to the people. So you have these different revolutions that are breaking out in the 1830s and 40s, and in particular 1830 and then 1848, that are seeking more rights for the people of Germany, France. There are revolutions in Belgium, Poland, Italy, all throughout this point, right? In Italy itself, you have a group founded by a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini called the Young Italians, or the Young Italy Party. And they are focusing on the restoration of a unified Italy, sort of hearkening back again to the Roman Empire. Because one thing about nationalism is, again, if we're looking at history, we want to look back to when were we all unified. In Belgium, it's trying to get out from under the rule of the Netherlands, the Dutch. It's all about this idea of how do we bring about a more unified, represented nation of people from outside of the empire. And that's really the big thing about nationalism here. Up until the mid-1800s, the way the world was organized was by empire, right? If we look at this map, and this is not terribly great, or even this map, right? Europe is dominated by the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, Prussia controlling all of this territory, France, a whole bunch of different Italian states. But there's nothing that necessarily, people who live on this side of Austria are not the same as the people who live on this side of Austria. Or the people who live in this part of Germany are not the same as the people who live in this part of Germany. But what people start to see is, I am more locally based. And that's where these ideas of nations come about. We are fighting against these large imperial bodies. And how do we get a state or a government that better represents me as a French man or an Austrian, not a Bohemian or a Hungarian? And that's what the point of this is all about. Nationalism is a fight against that empire. So one of the themes that we've been focusing on, and I will continue to focus on, is nationalism, but then the empire. And the point of today's lesson is to look at how does the nation come out to represent the people against the larger imperial body, and what are these revolutions of the 1830s and 40s in that context.